The night was thick with tension, the kind that makes a man's hand twitch toward his revolver even when he doesn't plan to use it. Outside the small timber lodge, the wind carried the distant clatter of hooves and the faint, metallic gleam of cavalry buttons under the moonlight. A single rider approached, the figure of a cavalry officer cutting a rigid line against the shadows, his spurs ringing softly as he drew near the doorway. His horse shifted uneasily, sensing the unease in the air that seemed to cling like smoke from a dying fire. The officer's voice was firm and commanding, cutting through the night with authority. He demanded entry to the lodge, his words sharp and unyielding, echoing in the hollow space between the surrounding hills. He did not know what he was about to find inside, and that ignorance would be the spark to ignite a chain of events no one could foresee. Inside the lodge, the atmosphere was different. The dim glow of a single lantern lit the room, casting long, trembling shadows across the walls. The smell of wood, smoke, and earth hung heavy in the air, grounding the space in a reality that felt both safe and fragile. In the corner, an Apache warrior crouched, alert and taut with quiet strength. His eyes, dark and calculating, followed the movement at the doorway even as he remained calm, each muscle ready to react at the first sign of danger. He knew the land, he knew the patterns of soldiers, and he knew the kind of trouble that followed rigid authority. Yet he also knew the sacredness of family, and his gaze drifted for a moment to the small, carefully folded blanket on the floor where his sister rested. That blanket was more than cloth. It was a shield, a line he would not allow to be crossed lightly. The officer's knock came again, sharper this time, a drumbeat of impatience and pride. He demanded the warmth of human presence, the certainty of compliance. But the warrior did not answer. He waited, observing, listening to the subtle creaks of the lodge floorboards, the shuffle of the wind through the cracks in the walls. The tension in the air thickened like a storm gathering behind the mountains. Every man outside the lodge, every officer on patrol, had a set of rules, a line they would not cross, and tonight those lines were on a collision course. The Apache's sister stirred beneath her blanket, sensing the unease that filled the room. She did not speak, but her quiet breathing carried a rhythm that tethered her brother's vigilance. He moved closer, the scrape of his boots soft against the worn wood, every step deliberate, measured. The officer's voice cut again, louder now, threaded with impatience and thinly veiled threat. He insisted on entering, asserting control in a way that came naturally to men trained to take what they wanted. Outside, the wind whipped a ragged pattern of sound through the trees, a warning or a herald, depending on how one listened. The warrior's mind raced, weighing options, calculating the consequences of action or inaction. A direct confrontation would bring fire, noise, and perhaps loss that neither side could afford. Yet to yield was to break a sacred trust, to compromise the safety of those he had vowed to protect. He could feel the weight of history pressing on him, the unspoken codes that had guided his people for generations, the bitter lessons of broken treaties and betrayed promises. Every decision tonight would ripple outward, far beyond the walls of this small, lonely lodge. The officer's hand rested near his holster, the steel glinting faintly in the lantern's glow. There was authority in the stance, certainty in the gesture, a promise that he would force compliance if given cause. Yet he had not accounted for the cunning and resolve of the warrior who held the threshold. The lodge, unremarkable to a casual observer, had become a crucible. It was more than wood and nails. It was a line drawn in the sand, a test of courage, of respect, of instinct honed through countless trials. Without warning, the warrior stepped forward, but not toward the officer. His movement was deliberate, protective, instinctual. His sister, still wrapped in her blanket, became the axis around which his decisions rotated. The officer's gaze followed him, expecting submission, expecting hesitation, expecting a move toward dialogue. Instead, he saw something unexpected, a silent assertion of control that was neither loud nor violent, but profoundly defiant. The tension inside the lodge escalated, a nearly tangible pressure that made the air feel heavier with each passing second. Outside, the officer's jaw tightened. His pride demanded respect, and he had never been denied before. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of sage and earth, mingling with the iron tang of anticipation. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote's howl punctuated the night, a reminder that the wilderness held its own rules, indifferent to human authority. The cavalry officer paused, measuring the distance between himself and the lodge, between expectation and reality, unsure of what lay beyond the threshold. The Apache warrior did not speak. His silence was as deliberate as any order, a statement of ownership and vigilance. Every fiber of his being radiated control and readiness, an unspoken message that the rules in this place were different. Inside the blanket, his sister remained unaware of the exact danger, but attuned to the tension, her instincts blending with her brother's resolve. The officer's hand twitched again near the doorway, the impatience of the outside world brushing against the calm, protective focus within. For a moment, the world seemed suspended. Time slowed, stretched over the ridge of a single heartbeat. The officer's confidence wavered, however subtly, as the warrior's calm intensity met his own. It was a challenge unspoken yet undeniable. Outside, the night deepened, shadows growing longer, shapes more defined, sounds sharper. The lodge was no longer a passive shelter. It was a stage, the air itself charged with the silent negotiation of wills. The warrior's gaze flicked to the doorway, noting the glint of authority, the expectation of compliance. He then turned his attention back to the blanket, a quiet declaration that some lines could not be crossed. Outside, the officer could sense the subtle shift, though he did not yet understand its significance. In this tension, history and instinct collided, the arrogance of command meeting the unyielding determination of heritage. The wind carried a sudden rustle through the lodge, and the officer's eyes narrowed, sensing movement he had not anticipated. The Apache warrior's hand rested briefly on the blanket, protective but unhurried, signaling the gravity of the moment. The night held its breath, the silence stretching long and taut, a string pulled tight between confrontation and restraint. The officer's mind raced, weighing the options, realizing that a single misstep could turn the evening into chaos. Yet the warrior remained steady, grounded in purpose, in the unshakable loyalty that guided him. He was a man shaped by the land, by its lessons, by the responsibility that weighed heavier than any uniform or title. The officer, for all his training, all his drills, all his experience, was about to discover that some authority did not bend under pressure, that some defenses were invisible yet impenetrable. The night thickened further, carrying the promise of an encounter that neither side could yet predict. Inside, the lantern flickered, casting light across the warrior's face, sharp and resolute, and then across the folds of the blanket where his sister lay. Every second counted, every breath measured, as the officer weighed the distance, the options, the potential for compromise or disaster. The lodge had become a crucible for courage, for instinct, for the collision of two worlds that rarely understood one another. As the cavalry officer finally shifted, preparing to assert his claim, the Apache warrior acted not with violence, not with words, but with a movement of quiet precision that left the officer unsure, unsettled, and cautious. The air vibrated with unspoken consequences, every detail amplified by the stillness around them. Somewhere beyond the lodge, the land itself seemed to lean closer, listening to the unvoiced standoff, aware that what would happen next could not be undone. The tension reached its edge, a thin line separating authority from defiance, the predictable from the unknown. The officer's hand hovered near his weapon, every muscle taut, every thought spinning toward action. The warrior's eyes, dark and steady, locked with his, a silent warning and a declaration. In that instant, the world narrowed to the space between them, the doorway, the blanket, the unspoken laws of protection and family, honor and courage. And then, without another word, the warrior moved again, a subtle action that shifted the balance of the night entirely. It was not aggression, yet it carried weight. It was not surrender, yet it challenged command. It was a line drawn, firm and unyielding, demanding recognition without the need for explanation. The officer hesitated, the night holding its breath, the forest and the lodge alike waiting for the outcome that neither could yet claim. A single sound, the scrape of boots on wood, a whisper of movement in the dark, and the standoff poised at the brink of chaos. The wind cut through the surrounding trees like a knife, carrying with it the distant memory of past battles, past grudges, and the fragile promise of decisions yet to be made. The cavalry officer's eyes narrowed, calculating, reassessing, knowing instinctively that the night had shifted. Inside, the warrior's hand rested lightly, almost casually on the blanket, a simple gesture heavy with meaning. The tension remained, unresolved and thick, a thread stretched across time and space, binding the lodge, the land, the officer, and the warrior into a moment neither could ignore. And in that silence the story waited, suspended on the edge of action, poised to leap into chaos or resolution, leaving nothing decided and everything possible. The officer's voice, finally breaking the quiet, trembled slightly, betraying a hint of uncertainty he had not intended. The warrior did not answer, did not flinch, only held his ground. A sentinel guarding more than a simple blanket, more than a single life, more than the expectations of a world that had never truly understood him. The night stretched on, the shadows deepened, and the first flicker of dawn still hours away. Yet in that darkness, in that fragile standoff, the story waited, ready to erupt with consequences that would shape every life near the lodge and every heart bound to it. The officer drew a deep breath, tension coiling in every muscle, and prepared to step forward, unaware that the path he chose would ignite a conflict far larger than the walls of the lodge, far deeper than any sense of duty or pride. And the Apache warrior, steady and unwavering, stood as the line that no man could easily cross, the keeper of honor, family, and unspoken law, holding the night and the story suspended on the knife edge of what would come next. The wind outside howled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of earth and the promise of confrontation. Inside, the warrior's eyes never left the doorway, and his hand remained on the blanket, firm and protective. Every heartbeat marked a second closer to the choice that would define the night. Neither man moved, yet everything in the air shifted, taut with tension, unresolved, a story ready to erupt, waiting for the moment when the calm could no longer hold, and the truth of courage, loyalty, and protection would finally be revealed. The lodge remained silent but alive, a crucible for decisions and actions that neither time nor law could fully contain. Outside, the cavalry officer's patience wavered, and the wind carried with it the echoes of the inevitable clash, a collision of worlds, wills, and instincts that would leave no heart untouched. And as the first shadow of movement hinted at the coming storm, the night held its breath, waiting for the moment when the story would finally break free, leaving all certainty behind. The tension, thick as smoke, held every secret and every threat. Inside, the blanket remained a shield, a symbol of the line drawn, a reminder that not all battles were fought with bullets or steel. Outside, the officer weighed his pride against the unknown, the certainty of training against the unpredictability of instinct. And somewhere between the two, the story waited, unresolved, dangerous, and impossible to ignore, ready to surge forward with the coming choices of men bound by duty, blood, and the wild, unbroken land around them. The lodge, the blanket, the night, and the standoff remained frozen. A heartbeat from eruption, every second stretched taut with possibility, leaving a story suspended on the edge of action and consequence, waiting for the first move that would change everything forever. The cavalry officer's boots scraped against the wooden threshold again, his patience wearing thin, though he masked it behind a mask of command. The lodge, small and unassuming, seemed to hold a weight the officer could not measure, a tension he could not break. Inside, the Apache warrior remained unmoving, silent, his dark eyes fixed on the doorway, while his sister lay beneath the blanket, unaware of the precise danger looming so close. He had learned long ago that strength was measured not in action alone, but in timing, in judgment, in knowing when to strike and when to wait. The officer, trained in orders and routines, could not grasp that kind of vigilance. The history between these lands and its people was older than the officer's uniform, older than any regiment stationed nearby. The Apache warrior had grown among stories of betrayal, of soldiers who marched in with guns and flags, declaring authority over land and lives that were never theirs to claim. His father had fought, his uncle had fought, and countless others before him had suffered for trusting the word of men who spoke one way and acted another. That history had shaped him, forged a careful caution that now defined every breath he took. The officer shifted his weight, glancing down the slope of the ridge where moonlight glinted against his horse's mane. His eyes flicked to the darkness beyond, where the lodge's small light betrayed little but enough for him to imagine movement. He had come with a mission, though whether he would admit it to himself remained unclear. Commands from superiors, the duty of a cavalry officer, and a pride that would not tolerate delay pressed against him, urging entry, demanding compliance. Yet inside the line had already been drawn. The blanket, a simple bundle of cloth, had become a boundary he could not cross without consequences he could not yet foresee. The Apache warrior's mind wandered briefly to the early years of his childhood, to the lessons taught in silence and observation. His father had shown him how to read the wind, how to interpret the creak of a tree, how to sense the danger before it arrived. His mother had shown him the value of protection, of defending those who could not defend themselves. And his sister, quiet and resilient, had become the center of his vigilance, the reason he would never yield, no matter the threat. She was the living symbol of every oath he had taken, every promise he had made to his family and to the land that had shaped them. Outside, the officer's eyes lingered on the doorway, noting the slight shift of shadows. He sensed something unspoken, a warning in the stillness that tugged at instincts he preferred not to trust. He had dealt with defiance before, with stubbornness and fear, but there was a subtle power in the lodge that unsettled him. He could not see the full measure of it, yet he felt it as clearly as he felt the chill of the night wind. Something about the way the warrior held himself, steady and unyielding, made the officer pause, forcing a reconsideration of his approach. The lodge itself seemed to breathe with history, with presence. The rough timbers bore the marks of past hands, each scratch a story, each knot a memory. The fire's glow had long since dimmed, leaving the lantern to flicker and cast unpredictable shapes across the walls. The Apache warrior stood between those walls and the officer, a living barrier as much as a sentinel. Every inch of space he occupied was claimed, defended, and grounded in a legacy of survival. And though he remained calm, his awareness extended in every direction, the crack of a floorboard, the subtle rustle of clothing, the almost imperceptible scent of the officer's impatience. A faint sound came from outside, the brushing of horse hooves against gravel, signaling that the officer's impatience was shared by his mount. The animal shifted, snorting softly, ears flicking toward the lodge as if sensing the unseen tension. The cavalry officer's hand brushed against the worn leather of his holster, his fingers curling around the familiar weight of steel. He was trained to act decisively, to enforce control, to follow orders without hesitation. Yet, even as he prepared to assert authority, a nagging uncertainty lingered, whispering that tonight would not be settled by rank alone. Inside, the Apache warrior shifted slightly, careful not to disturb the blanket or his sister. His eyes scanned the doorway, calculating the distance, the likelihood of action, the possibilities for a move that would preserve both honor and safety. He had faced soldiers before, had navigated standoffs and raids. Yet there was something different in the officer who now demanded entry. He carried not only authority but expectation, a certainty that his commands would be met without resistance. The warrior recognized the danger in that certainty. It often led to mistakes, and tonight, a single mistake could escalate beyond control. The officer cleared his throat, a low, commanding sound that carried both frustration and warning. He did not know that he faced more than a man. He faced years of history, of instinct, of protective instinct sharpened by the harsh lessons of a land where trust was rare and survival required calculation. The Apache warrior's fingers lingered near the edge of the blanket, a subtle motion that was protective yet deliberate, signaling the weight of what he guarded without words. The officer's eyes flicked to it, curiosity piqued, suspicion sharpening, though he could not yet read its significance. Beyond the lodge, shadows lengthened as the night deepened, the wind carrying whispers from the hills and the trees. Somewhere in the distance, the faint call of an owl punctuated the silence, reminding both men that the land itself was alive, watching, aware. The cavalry officer's mind began to weigh the options, the potential for confrontation, the need to assert authority without inviting disaster. Inside, the warrior's mind traced the same considerations, only with a different measure: the value of restraint, the cost of action, the lines drawn by loyalty and family that could not be crossed. The Apache warrior remembered the night his father had taught him to face a threat without striking prematurely. "Wait," his father had said, "and let the danger show its hand. Only then do you act. That lesson, etched into his mind through years of practice, guided him now. The officer believed he controlled the situation, yet control was an illusion where instincts and history intersected. The warrior understood that the next moments could define everything: the safety of his sister, the honor of his family, the fragile balance of the night. The officer's spurs jingled softly as he shifted, a subtle sign of his growing frustration. He had expected compliance, yet every instinct told him he would not receive it. Inside, the Apache warrior's eyes never left the doorway, his body steady, his breathing calm but purposeful. He could feel the officer's tension, like heat against the skin, a pressure that pressed against the edges of his focus. And he welcomed it, for it was a measure of understanding. The officer's certainty was a tool, a marker of the conflict to come. Memories of past encounters flickered through the warrior's mind, battles fought with words, with guns, with strategy. He remembered raids on settlements, confrontations that ended in fire and blood, lessons learned about patience, about timing, about the unseen power of a quiet but resolute stance. Those lessons guided his every decision now. The blanket, the small light, the unassuming lodge, each held significance far beyond their appearance, each part of a delicate equation that balanced on the edge of consequence. Outside, the cavalry officer shifted his weight, a subtle sign of uncertainty creeping into his posture. He was trained to act quickly, decisively, yet something about the lodge, about the warrior, made him hesitate. That pause, brief but vital, was a victory the Apache recognized silently. He did not move closer, did not draw a weapon, but he held the space, controlled the line, and carried the weight of expectation that the officer could not yet understand. The wind whispered through the trees, rustling dry leaves, brushing against the sides of the lodge like fingers seeking entry. Inside, the Apache warrior's eyes flicked to the small shadows cast by the lantern, noting every detail, reading every hint of movement. His sister remained still, calm in her trust, unaware of the growing tension, but her presence anchored his resolve. He could not allow the officer to cross that invisible line, not tonight, not ever. The officer's hand hovered near the holster again, hesitation and authority wrestling in his mind. He was trained to assume compliance, to command respect through presence alone, yet he faced something unquantifiable, a force not measured by rank or weaponry. The Apache warrior's quiet vigilance, the protective attention to the blanket, the subtle assertion of presence, these were forces he had never accounted for. And in that realization, uncertainty crept in, slow but undeniable, fracturing the officer's confidence as the night pressed on. Inside the lodge, every sound was amplified: the creak of a floorboard, the flutter of a blanket, the faint breathing of a sister. The Apache warrior's attention spanned every inch, a web of awareness anchored in instinct, experience, and loyalty. Outside, the cavalry officer remained tense, every step measured, every glance cautious, knowing instinctively that a misstep could turn the night into something irreversible. The wind shifted again, carrying distant sounds of movement from the hills, a reminder that the land held more than one pair of eyes, more than one judgment. The officer's patience thinned further, his voice raising slightly, commanding entry with authority sharpened by frustration. Inside, the Apache warrior did not flinch. He remained grounded, steady, a sentinel between threat and protection, embodying the line that no man had yet crossed. Every second stretched, taut, and waited, the standoff growing in intensity. The lodge, the blanket, the night itself seemed alive with anticipation. Neither man moved, yet everything shifted around them: the air, the wind, the shadows, the unspoken rules of honor, loyalty, and protection. And somewhere in that suspended moment, the story waited, ready to explode with the choices to come, leaving every heart bound to the lodge on edge, waiting for the night's truth to finally break free. The cavalry officer's gaze flicked to the lantern, to the shadowed corners, to the subtle movements he could not fully interpret. Doubt crept into his mind, a quiet but persistent whisper. Inside, the Apache warrior's resolve did not waver. He knew the stakes, the history, the cost of miscalculation. He held the line with patience, with vigilance, with the quiet strength that had defined him since childhood. And in that shared silence, the lodge became more than shelter. It was a battlefield of presence and will, a test of courage and restraint, a crucible where every decision mattered. Outside, the cavalry officer's hand trembled ever so slightly, the first sign that certainty was no longer his ally. Inside, the Apache warrior's grip on the blanket remained firm, protective, a simple act heavy with meaning, an assertion of boundaries that could not be ignored. The night stretched onward, thick with tension, unresolved and dangerous. The air carried the weight of history, of instinct, of the delicate balance between threat and protection. And in that tension, in that stillness, the story waited, poised on the edge of action, unresolved, a living pulse that could ignite with a single movement. A single decision, a single breach of line. The cavalry officer's jaw tightened, the lantern flickered, and the wind whispered through the trees once more. The Apache warrior stood steady, unyielding, a shadow against shadow, a line that could not be crossed. And somewhere between the two, the story pulsed, alive, unresolved, waiting for the night to finally decide which way it would fall. The night stretched on, the air heavy with anticipation, each second a test of patience for the men and the land that held them. Outside, the cavalry officer shifted, the weight of his pride pressing against the uncertainty he could not shake. His boots sank slightly into the frost-hardened soil. Each step deliberate, measured, the subtle crunch of gravel underfoot a rhythm that punctuated the tension. He had arrived at the lodge with orders, with the authority of uniform and rank, yet the presence inside challenged him in ways he had not prepared for. The officer's eyes flicked repeatedly to the faint glow spilling from the small window, tracing shadows and shapes he could not fully interpret. Inside, the Apache warrior remained still, every sense alert. The room was simple, worn with years of use, yet it contained everything that mattered: the lantern's glow, the blanket wrapped around his sister, and the silence that stretched between him and the intruder outside. He had learned to read men like the officer, trained through years of observation and experience to catch the flicker of hesitation, the tension in the hand hovering near a weapon, the subtle shift in posture that betrayed a mind considering violence. He had seen men like this before, confident in their authority yet unprepared for resistance rooted in instinct and history. The warrior thought of his sister, how young she was, how fragile the world outside the lodge could be. He had protected her through harsh winters, through raids and threats, through the silent menace of a land that did not forgive carelessness. Her presence was a constant anchor, a reminder of every oath he had taken. And yet, he knew the officer represented more than a single threat. He embodied a force that sought control, a world that demanded obedience, and a reality that did not bend to personal loyalty or instinct. Outside, the cavalry officer took a slow breath, trying to regain the calm his training demanded. He had faced stubborn men before, men who resisted for pride or principle, yet this situation felt different. The lodge, so unremarkable to the casual eye, radiated something he could not name: an unspoken power, a quiet authority that defied the hierarchy he had been taught to respect. He wondered what the man inside had seen, what he knew, what he was willing to defend. The officer had come expecting compliance, expecting the rules to apply, expecting the night to bend to him. Instead, he faced a wall of resolve as impenetrable as any timber, as sharp as any rifle. The warrior's gaze swept over the room, absorbing the details that others would dismiss. The corners were worn, the floorboards uneven, but nothing was careless. Every object, every space had a purpose, and every movement was calculated, measured. He considered the officer's position outside, the way the man's weight shifted, the glint of steel at his hip, the slight quiver in his jaw. He recognized the signs of uncertainty, the subtle cracks in confidence that could be exploited without violence. Patience was his weapon now, more effective than any gun. The cavalry officer's voice finally broke the silence, steady but carrying the edge of irritation. He demanded entry again, repeating his insistence with authority sharpened by pride. He had spent his life following orders, executing commands without hesitation, yet the lodge refused him. Inside, the warrior did not answer. He did not need words. His presence alone communicated resistance, protection, and vigilance. Every movement, every pause, every glance toward the blanket where his sister rested spoke volumes more than any shouted command ever could. A sudden gust of wind rattled the wooden shutters, and the officer's horse shifted nervously beneath him. He drew in a breath and glanced toward the horizon, where the darkness pressed against the edges of the forest. In that instant he considered the larger context of his mission, the orders that brought him to the lodge, the larger conflict simmering in the surrounding valleys, the raids and skirmishes that had already left scars on men and land alike. This was no isolated encounter. It was part of a web, a chain of actions and consequences that extended far beyond the small timber walls. Inside, the Apache warrior remembered the stories told by elders in the long evenings near the fire. Tales of battles fought for survival, of men who came with authority and left in defeat, of families torn apart by unheeded warnings. Those lessons guided him now. Every detail mattered, every sound and shadow carried meaning. The officer outside represented more than an immediate threat. He represented the continuation of a history written in conflict and misunderstanding. The warrior's silence was deliberate, a shield against rash action and an assertion of control that needed no words. The officer's fingers twitched near the hilt of his revolver, the cool metal a reminder of training, of control, of the power he could exert with a single motion. Yet something about the stillness inside the lodge unsettled him. He had expected hesitation, resistance, perhaps a brief confrontation, but not this depth of quiet confidence. He could feel the weight of history pressing on him, the invisible presence of past conflicts, of oaths broken and honored, of instincts forged in harsh realities. For the first time, the officer considered that his authority might not be absolute, that the world outside the walls of command held rules he had yet to understand. The Apache warrior shifted slightly, careful not to disturb the blanket, careful not to reveal his full awareness. He understood the officer's impatience, the desire to impose control, the need to assert rank. Yet he also understood the limits of action, the importance of restraint, and the line that could never be crossed. His sister's safety anchored his resolve, every decision filtered through the lens of protection, every movement guided by instinct sharpened through years of vigilance. Outside, the cavalry officer's mind raced through possibilities. Retreat was not an option. He could not afford the shame of leaving orders unfulfilled. Yet entry by force was risky, uncertain, and potentially disastrous. Every angle carried consequence, every decision held weight. He had spent years learning to act decisively, yet tonight, indecision had become its own weapon, pressing against him, forcing reconsideration, forcing awareness of the unknown force that held him at bay. The warrior's thoughts turned briefly to his own past. He recalled the raids, the times when enemies had come seeking compliance and left with nothing but the lesson of patience and vigilance. He remembered the faces of those who underestimated him, the cost of misjudgment, and the quiet satisfaction of defending what mattered most. His resolve was not born of pride alone. It was grounded in survival, loyalty, and the deep understanding that some battles required endurance more than immediate action. The cavalry officer stepped closer to the doorway, his hand brushing against the rough wood as he tested the boundaries. He had assumed that proximity would force recognition, that presence alone would command submission. Yet inside, the warrior's stillness remained unbroken, the blanket and unyielding barrier that spoke of protection, loyalty, and a refusal to bend. The officer's confidence faltered, replaced by the first flickers of doubt he had ever felt in such a confrontation. The wind outside shifted again, carrying distant sounds, perhaps the rustle of deer, perhaps the whisper of something else moving in the dark. The officer's gaze darted toward the shadows, every sense heightened, every instinct warning him that control was an illusion. Inside, the Apache warrior's awareness extended beyond the room, reading the nuances of light and shadow, sound and motion, and calculating the outcomes with precision. Every heartbeat, every breath, every glance carried significance. The officer's voice rose again, firm and commanding, yet tinged with frustration. He demanded entry, repeating orders as if repetition could bend the night itself. Inside, the warrior's hand rested lightly on the blanket, protective and deliberate, a silent assertion that some lines were never meant to be crossed. The tension between them grew, a coil of anticipation that tightened with each passing moment. Outside, the officer's confidence wavered further, the uncertainty a subtle but dangerous adversary. Memories flickered through the warrior's mind, fragments of past lessons and encounters. He remembered the nights when threats had come with guns and words, when the lives of those he loved had rested in his hands, and when patience had saved more than force ever could. Those lessons guided him now, shaping every decision, every glance, every measured breath. The officer could see defiance, but he could not see the depth of experience, the history etched into the warrior's resolve. The night pressed on, the lodge holding its secrets close. Outside, the cavalry officer's boots dug into the cold soil, every movement deliberate, calculated, uncertain. Inside, the Apache warrior's gaze swept over every detail, from the flickering lantern to the blanket at his sister's side. He understood the stakes, the potential for escalation, the fragility of the moment, yet he remained steadfast, a line that could not be crossed without consequence. The wind carried a low, distant sound, a reminder that the land itself was alive, aware and indifferent to human authority. The officer's hand hovered again, tension coiling in every muscle, every thought racing through possibilities and risks. Inside, the warrior remained calm, every motion purposeful, every instinct aligned with the need to protect, to guard, to hold the night steady. The air was thick with history, with tension, with the weight of unspoken rules. The cavalry officer's voice faltered slightly, the certainty of command tempered by the unknown he faced. Inside, the Apache warrior's grip on the blanket remained steady, a quiet but potent assertion of control. Every second stretched, taut and heavy with possibility, each movement carrying significance beyond what either man fully understood. The standoff continued, unresolved, a delicate balance between authority and instinct, pride and protection, history and presence. The officer could not predict the warrior's next move, nor could he fully comprehend the depth of resolve that held the line. The lodge, simple and unassuming, had become the center of a larger conflict, a battleground of will and instinct, of past lessons and immediate stakes. Every heartbeat echoed, every breath measured, every shadow watched. The night, the lodge, the blanket, the officer, the warrior, they were bound together in a suspended moment, a story waiting to erupt, waiting for the first choice that would break the balance. And in that stillness, in that tension, the world seemed to hold its breath, aware that the outcome, whatever it might be, could not be undone. The wind had died down, leaving a heavy stillness that pressed against the lodge like a living thing. The cavalry officer's horse shifted nervously, hooves scraping against frost-hardened soil. The officer himself remained frozen just outside the doorway, a mixture of authority and unease etching lines across his face. He had been trained to act decisively, to command respect, to bend the world to orders and rank, but this night defied everything he had known. He could sense, though not fully understand, that inside waited a force he could not intimidate with words or uniform alone. Inside, the Apache warrior crouched low, his hand resting lightly on the blanket that shielded his sister. His mind raced, yet his movements were deliberate, measured. He thought of every lesson taught by father and elders, every story of men who came with guns and left empty-handed, every time patience had saved more than immediate action ever could. The night had become a crucible, testing instinct against authority, loyalty against pride, patience against impatience. Every sound carried weight, the faint rustle of the blanket, the quiet creak of floorboards, the subtle sigh of wind moving through the trees. The officer shifted his weight, tension coiling in every muscle. He could feel the uncertainty in the air, as if the lodge itself resisted him, as if the shadows leaned toward the warrior inside, lending strength and presence to a line that refused to bend. He tried to assert his authority with voice alone, calling again for entry, repeating the demand with the sharp insistence drilled into him since the first day of his training. But the silence inside was absolute. It carried the weight of history, of resistance, of instinct refined over generations, and it unsettled him more than any threat of violence could. The Apache warrior's sister stirred, shifting slightly beneath the blanket, though not enough to reveal herself. Her breathing was calm, trusting, and that trust anchored him in the room like a root in solid earth. He had protected her through every hardship, the bitter winters, the raids, the relentless pressure of a world that rarely understood loyalty. And tonight he would protect her again, even if it required patience that tested the limits of his endurance. The officer's hand brushed against the hilt of his revolver, the steel cool against his palm, and he considered his options. He could force entry, he could retreat, he could wait, each choice fraught with risk. He had faced stubborn men before, men who refused to bend, yet this situation was unlike any he had known. The lodge, simple and unassuming to a casual observer, had become a fortress of will, and every shadow inside seemed to hold the weight of history, the strength of vigilance, the silent promise of consequences. The wind whispered through the trees again, stirring the branches above the lodge and carrying a faint rustle of leaves. Somewhere beyond, the faint hoot of an owl punctuated the quiet, a reminder that the land itself observed and waited. The officer's patience frayed, the cadence of his commands growing sharper, tinged with frustration. Inside, the warrior did not flinch. He remained steady, every movement measured, every breath controlled, every thought anchored in the responsibility he bore. Time seemed suspended. Every second stretched long, heavy with possibility and consequence. The officer's confidence wavered as he realized that this night was unlike the drills and orders he had known. The Apache warrior's presence inside the lodge was more than defiance. It was a challenge, a statement of control, a quiet assertion that some lines could not be crossed. The officer felt the subtle shift in power, the way the calm patience of the warrior held him at bay, and it unsettled him in ways no command ever could. The warrior's thoughts turned to the past, to his family, to the lessons learned in silent moments beside fires and under the stars. He remembered the raids, the threats, the nights when vigilance had saved lives. He remembered his father's voice, steady and firm, teaching that timing could be the difference between survival and loss. Those lessons guided him now. His sister, beneath the blanket, was more than family. She was the embodiment of every oath he had taken, every promise to protect, every instinct sharpened through years of necessity. Outside, the officer shifted again, the horse responding with a soft snort. He could see the shadows dancing faintly against the doorway, could sense the stillness inside, and it unnerved him. He had assumed that proximity and persistence would bend the situation to his will, yet the lodge held something he could not name, something beyond the reach of rank or command. He wondered how far the warrior's patience would extend, how long he could resist, and what would happen if either side acted too soon. The Apache warrior moved slightly, a subtle adjustment that revealed nothing yet carried purpose. His hand brushed the edge of the blanket, protective but deliberate, a line drawn without words. He had long ago learned that control could be maintained not only through action but through presence and vigilance. The officer outside could sense the tension, the quiet assertion of will, though he could not see it fully. Every instinct he possessed warned him that the next moment could determine the night's outcome, and yet indecision held him frozen. The wind shifted again, carrying the scent of sage and earth, of cold soil and distant fires. The officer's eyes darted to the surrounding trees, to the shadows, to the subtle movements he could not yet interpret. The night itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the first choice, the first action, the spark that would ignite everything. Inside, the warrior's gaze swept over the room, every corner, every shadow, every detail accounted for. He understood the stakes, the consequences, and the fragile balance that hung on the edge of action. The officer's voice rose, firm and commanding, tinged with frustration. He demanded entry again, as if repetition could force compliance. Inside, the warrior did not respond. He remained calm, steady, a sentinel guarding the line between safety and chaos, protecting the one he had sworn to shield. Every pause, every glance, every subtle shift of his hand was a deliberate signal, a reminder that some authority could not be forced without cost. The officer's hand twitched near the revolver again, the weight of possibility pressing against him. He had faced resistance before, yet never with such quiet intensity, never with such an unyielding measure of control. The Apache warrior's presence inside the lodge radiated a confidence born of experience, of survival, of a lineage hardened by history and necessity. It unsettled the officer in ways he could not name, and that uncertainty grew heavier with each passing second. Inside, the warrior remembered the battles fought long before this night, the confrontations that shaped his instinct and defined his vigilance. He recalled the lessons of patience, the value of timing, the subtle but powerful effect of stillness and observation. He knew that action would come, that the night would not hold its tension forever, but he would not yield until every risk, every consequence, every possibility was accounted for. The wind whispered through the lodge's timbers, a soft susurration that carried distant sounds, the brush of branches, the faint rustle of leaves, the subtle movement of life in the dark. Outside, the officer's breath quickened, his frustration mounting, the uncertainty pressing against the rigid structure of his authority. Inside, the warrior remained steady, a constant presence that anchored the room and held the night in balance. The officer's mind raced through strategies, potential outcomes, contingencies. He considered retreat, confrontation, negotiation, and hesitation, but each option carried unknown dangers. Inside, the warrior's fingers lingered on the blanket, a subtle yet powerful reminder that the line he defended was not just physical, it was sacred, personal, and absolute. The officer could sense the weight of it, though he could not measure it, and it left him teetering between action and hesitation. The shadows inside the lodge shifted as the lantern flickered, a reflection of the tension outside. The Apache warrior's gaze swept over the room once more, absorbing every detail, calculating every possibility. He knew that the officer's patience would not last forever, that action was inevitable, and that the night was poised at the edge of eruption. Yet he remained steady, waiting for the right moment, every movement deliberate, every breath controlled. Outside, the cavalry officer's boots sank slightly into the frost-hardened soil as he shifted weight. The subtle creak a reminder of his presence. He could feel the tension stretching between himself and the lodge, a thin line holding back the inevitable. Every instinct screamed that the night could erupt at any moment, that the first action would set off a chain reaction with consequences neither could yet predict. The wind carried whispers, faint and ghost-like, that heightened the suspense, the uncertainty, the anticipation of what would come next. Inside, the Apache warrior's sister stirred slightly beneath the blanket, and he adjusted his hand over her with quiet precision. The line between safety and danger was sharp, fragile, and immediate. Every shadow, every sound, every subtle movement mattered. The officer outside could feel the pressure, the unseen hand of history and instinct that guided the warrior within, and it unsettled him. The night seemed to hold its breath with them, every element of the surrounding land waiting for the moment when balance would shatter. The officer's fingers tightened around the revolver, yet he did not draw. The tension of indecision gripped him as the warrior's calm, measured presence radiated a power beyond rank or command. Inside, every muscle of the Apache was coiled, ready for action but restrained, every instinct focused on protection, loyalty, and survival. The air between them was thick with anticipation, every heartbeat and breath stretched taut, the story suspended at the edge of eruption. And then in the silence, a faint sound broke the tension, a branch snapping somewhere beyond the lodge, a small disturbance that neither man could ignore. The officer's eyes widened, a flash of decision sparking in his mind, and the warrior's hand tightened slightly on the blanket, awareness sharpening like a blade. The moment had arrived, the calm before the storm, the pivot point on which the night would turn. Every choice, every action, every instinct carried the weight of consequence. The standoff, drawn tight for hours, was about to reach its peak, yet resolution remained just out of reach, the suspense unbearable, the anticipation electrifying. The branch snapped louder this time, the sound cutting through the night air like a warning. Both men tensed, ready for action, but instead of movement, a sudden silence followed, as if the land itself held its breath. The cavalry officer's hand hovered near the revolver, yet he did not draw. He realized in that instant that force alone would not resolve this standoff. The weight of history, the measure of restraint, the quiet strength of the warrior inside the lodgall of it pressed against him, demanding a different approach. The Apache warrior's eyes never left the doorway, but his grip on the blanket loosened just enough to signal awareness without aggression. His sister stirred slightly beneath the fabric, peering up with trust and curiosity, unaware of the tension that had stretched for hours. He spoke softly, his voice low but firm, carrying the weight of authority earned over years of vigilance. "You do not understand what lies beyond this threshold. Step carefully, or there will be consequences neither of us desire." The words were not a threat, but a clear boundary, a declaration that the night would not bend to force. The officer hesitated, his jaw tight, the rigid structure of his training struggling against the reality of what he faced. For the first time, he questioned his assumptions. The world outside the lodge had always obeyed orders, complied with authority, bent to the power of uniform and rank. Yet here, in this small timber shelter on the edge of the wilderness, all that power seemed to dissolve, leaving only the raw truth of human instinct, loyalty, and restraint. Slowly, he lowered his hand from the revolver, the first small act of concession, and let his eyes meet the warrior's gaze. Time seemed to stretch again, the air thick with anticipation, but a subtle shift had occurred. Respect, fragile and tentative, threaded its way through the standoff. The officer realized that Apache's position was not born of defiance alone, but of purpose and protection. The blanket, the silence, the careful stance all spoke of family, of history, of a principle that could not be broken by threats or force. And, in that recognition, something changed. The rigid lines of command began to soften, replaced by a cautious understanding. The warrior relaxed just enough to allow movement without compromising safety. He adjusted the blanket around his sister, ensuring she remained protected yet free to observe. Her eyes widened slightly as she noticed the officer's lowered hand, the tension in the doorway easing. The small act of acknowledgement, almost imperceptible, was enough to shift the dynamic. The officer nodded once, curtly, signaling that he understood the limits of authority here, and the first tentative bridge of communication formed between the two men. "Your orders—" "I follow them differently," the officer said, his voice steady but devoid of the earlier sharp edge. "But I see now what must be respected." The Apache warrior studied him for a moment, reading the sincerity beneath the words. There was no triumph in his gaze, only careful calculation and measured observation. He did not need more than that. The balance had shifted, the threat contained not by force but by understanding. The silence that followed carried the weight of hours, the history of conflict and survival, the unspoken acknowledgement of human instinct. The officer finally stepped closer, keeping his hands visible, every motion deliberate and non-threatening. The warrior did not move to block him, merely observed, ensuring that each step was deliberate, intentional. Trust, fragile and earned, began to thread between them, binding the night in a quiet resolution. The warrior's sister emerged from beneath the blanket, small and cautious, yet curious. Her presence softened the tension even further, reminding both men of the stakes beyond pride and protocol. The officer's eyes softened as he regarded her, and in that moment, the human element outweighed all orders, all assumptions, all authority. The night, heavy and tense for hours, seemed to exhale along with them, releasing the grip of fear and anticipation that had held them both in thrall. The Apache warrior nodded subtly, signaling that the immediate threat had passed. The land, the people, they demand patience. That is the lesson tonight. His words, simple and clear, carried the weight of centuries. The wisdom of survival and the recognition that human life, family, and loyalty were the true measures of strength. The officer absorbed the meaning, feeling the rigidity of his training ease into a new understanding. A distant howl carried on the wind, the cry of wolves or coyotes, but it no longer seemed threatening. It was a reminder of the untamed world outside, the wild that demanded respect and vigilance. The officer turned toward his horse, taking a measured breath, and felt the tension of the night finally beginning to release. He had come seeking compliance, but what he found was something deeper: recognition of limits, respect for loyalty, and the power of restraint. Inside the lodge, the warrior allowed himself a subtle smile. The night had tested him, stretched him to the edge, and affirmed the lessons he had learned since boyhood. His sister watched him quietly, sensing the change, understanding in her own way that safety had been preserved, that vigilance had triumphed without violence. The lodge, once a battleground of tension and authority, had become a place of understanding, a space where instincts and history aligned to preserve what mattered most. The officer finally spoke again, this time with a softer tone. "I came with orders, but I see now that some things cannot be forced. I respect your strength, your protection, your wisdom." The words carried weight, bridging a gap that had seemed unbridgeable hours before. The warrior nodded once, acknowledging the sincerity without letting down his guard entirely. Respect had been earned, boundaries had been honored, and the night's trial had drawn to a quiet, satisfying close. The fire that had long since burned low was rekindled, small flames casting light on the worn timbers of the lodge. The warmth carried comfort and safety, and the atmosphere shifted from tension to cautious relief. The officer removed his hat, a gesture of acknowledgement, of respect, and the warrior returned the nod in kind. The lodge, simple and unassuming, held within its walls a story of conflict, restraint, and human instinct, a microcosm of the struggles that had long defined the land. The Apache warrior's sister approached cautiously, standing beside him, her trust in him absolute. The officer regarded her with respect, understanding that the outcome of the night was not measured by orders enforced or authority asserted, but by the lives preserved and the lessons learned. The three of them, warrior, sister, and officer, stood in the small room, each carrying a piece of the night's story, each aware that understanding and respect had replaced conflict, at least for now. The officer's horse shifted outside, the sound grounding the moment in reality. The warrior and his sister exchanged a glance, a silent agreement that the night's trial had ended without harm. The officer reached down, adjusting the straps of his saddle, and offered a nod of acknowledgement. "Tonight I learned more than any order could teach," he said, his voice steady, carrying the weight of experience and newfound respect. The warrior allowed himself a quiet exhale, the tension draining from his shoulders. The night had been long, the stakes high, yet the outcome reaffirmed every lesson he had learned since childhood. Patience, vigilance, loyalty, and protection had carried the day. Force had not been necessary. The officer, once rigid in command, had seen the power of restraint, the weight of instinct, the value of human connection over protocol. As dawn began to touch the edges of the horizon, faint light spilling over the ridge, the lodge seemed to exhale, the night giving way to a new day. The officer mounted his horse, and with a final nod of acknowledgement to the warrior and his sister, he began the slow ride back toward the settlement. The lessons of the night would remain with him, reshaping the rigid lines of authority into something tempered by respect and understanding. Inside, the Apache warrior gathered the blanket around his sister, securing it with care, and looked out the doorway toward the fading silhouette of the departing officer. The night's tension had passed, leaving clarity in its wake. He had preserved what mattered most, safeguarded his family, and upheld the legacy of vigilance and restraint passed down through generations. The air was lighter now, carrying the quiet promise of peace. The small lodge, once the center of an intense standoff, had become a space of understanding, a reminder that true strength was measured not in weapons drawn, but in patience, protection, and respect. The warrior's sister smiled softly, sensing the end of the night's trial, and together they stepped outside, the cold morning air brushing against their faces, as the first light painted the land in shades of gold and silver. The cavalry officer's words lingered in the air, a quiet echo of the night's lessons. Some things cannot be forced. Some lines cannot be crossed. The warrior nodded silently, understanding that the night had tested all present, yet had resolved not through violence but through the careful measure of human instinct and loyalty. The horizon promised new challenges, but also the certainty that the principles that guided them tonight would endure. The lodge stood in quiet stillness, a testament to restraint, vigilance, and the quiet victories that do not appear in reports or orders. The Apache warrior and his sister moved within it with confidence, aware that the night had affirmed what mattered most. Outside, the officer rode away, carrying the weight of lessons learned, a story etched into the memory of the land and the people who had faced each other not with destruction, but with understanding. The sun rose fully over the ridge, washing the land in light, and the world seemed at once vast and intimate, dangerous and full of possibility. The Apache warrior looked out across the fields and ridges, feeling the pulse of the land, the enduring rhythm of vigilance and loyalty, and the quiet satisfaction of a night survived without loss. His sister beside him, safe and unafraid, was proof that patience, instinct, and respect had carried them through the darkness. The cavalry officer, riding slowly back toward the settlement, felt the lessons of the night settle into his mind. Orders and authority were important, he knew, but they were not absolute. There were forces beyond rank, beyond protocol, that demanded understanding, respect, and caution. The night's standoff would remain a quiet memory, a testament to restraint, a story of tension resolved not through violence, but through the enduring strength of human instinct and loyalty. And as the day fully arrived, painting the landscape with warmth and light, All three warrior, sister, and officer moved forward with a newfound clarity. The night had tested them, shaped them, and left them with a story of respect, protection, and the quiet triumph of restraint over conflict. The world remained wild and unpredictable, but the lessons endured and the peace earned was real, lasting and earned through courage, patience, and understanding.